Second Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 3. It says, "Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worship, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God." And in verse 5, "Don't you remember that when I was with you, I used to tell you these things, and now you know what is holding him back, so that he may be revealed at the proper time. For the secret power of lawlessness is already at work, but the one who now holds it back will continue to do so till he is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow with the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendor of his coming." So here in Second Thessalonians, what does Apostle Paul say? He says the man of lawlessness was already around at that time. Kind of strange, because if you think about it, right? If the according to SDA and World Mission Society Church of God, if the Antichrist is the Roman Catholic Church, they didn't appear until later. You couldn't understand the fulfillment until hundreds of years later after that. Apostle Paul and Apostle John, the apostles of the early church, understood the Antichrist was already in the world. So then that begs the question, who is the Antichrist? And so that's why I didn't want to get too much into it, because in Daniel's is kind of vague, but in Revelation, oh man, it's so amazing how we can, understand clearly, what we in Revelation. It's way easier to understand how the Roman Catholic Church does not fit the criteria to be the Antichrist, and the audience and the time frame that the Apostle John explained when the Antichrist was going to appear and what the characteristics of him, were going to be, so that those people living in those days could understand clearly. And so, looking forward to, maybe one of these days we can do like a part 2 of that. But
yeah, for sure.
For now, I don't know if you got something else you want to add to that, Jordan, or if you want to.
No, I'm just along for the ride right now. So,
okay. Right.
So yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean,
were you wanting to jump to Revelation, or was that where you were saying wait for another day?
Yeah, because I think Revelation is going to take way longer than. And I feel like I won't do it justice if I just try to make it
rush
really
through it. Yep.
quick. Yeah, rush through it. So if you want, if you got something else in mind that you want to talk about.
Well, I guess what I wanted to, I'll just add to that is I think that, there's a lot of assumptions about how one has to interpret, the prophecies that you might find in Daniel or Revelation. And there's this assumption, I don't know where exactly it, how old the idea originated in church history, but sort of the assumption that, when you look at, just smack the mic. Oops. When you look at Revelation, Daniel, these places, that it's referring to like the end of the world sort of scenario, like something that's still yet to come. And more when I've, looked and rethought some of the prophecies, like Jesus in the Olivet discourse, where he's talking about, the end of the age and things like that. This would be, like you said, a whole other video to get into, but I think there's a lot more biblical, historical reason to think that much of what he prophesied and was talking about was already fulfilled, and was referring to events that would soon take place. There's so many mentions of things like that, where even in Revelation, he says, he talks about how these things must soon take place. And, what you mentioned, that he says, don't seal these things up. In Daniel, he said, seal these things up because there's a while until they're going to be fulfilled. In Revelation, he says, don't seal them up, as if like it's very soon. And I think that much makes a lot more sense when you think about, and to those who aren't familiar, like in 70 AD, there was the destruction of Jerusalem. The Roman army surrounded the city, burned it to the ground. And there's a lot of, there's different groups of people who look at like the prophecies in Revelation and in Matthew 24 and see those as referring to that event. And to me, when I look at that, it just makes a lot more sense. And when I feel like it's kind of a problem that Christians kind of use Revelation, and they use, not just cult groups like the WMSCOG, but I've grown up with regular sort of like end of the world predictions and people predicting who the Antichrist was. And it just seems like, I kind of got to a point where it's like, man, what's going on here? Maybe we're just missing something because everybody is making these predictions and it's always wrong. It's always wrong. And when you start to kind of, I think, put together the history surrounding 70 AD, and then you look a little bit closer at some of the things that Jesus said, you understand what you were kind of touching on, Edgar, that the Revelation was written to a Jewish audience who would have understood the symbolic language and the even just the genre of the book. And there's just so much language being used that is drawn directly from the Old Testament. And these people would have understood that. They would have understood what these things meant and would have not, I would argue, would not have taken them to mean so many of the things that we assume that they mean.
Right.
I don't think they would have thought that all these things were referring to like the end of the world per se, but and so I guess we can kind of wrap this up because I think it would be I know that we got a couple questions, I think, but I just think it's worth looking at, and I brought this up to a member, but there's a verse in Matthew 24. Let me pull it up real quick.
You're kind of getting me to want to touch on it, Jordan, because you're bringing up a lot of the juicy points on there.
Stirring it up. I think you're right. It would be good to wait because I would like to be a little bit more prepared for it. But let me see here. Okay, so Matthew 24. So Jesus is talking to the disciples. He talks about, and this is one that does the WMSCOG use this passage too?
Matthew 24, regularly? The whole chapter, or what verse specifically?
I mean, this is one that is pretty easily taken as referring to end of the world events. So I'm just kind of assuming that they probably like this chapter quite a bit.
They love Matthew chapter 24.
Yeah. Okay. That's I kind of assumed that. So Jesus talks about kind of like the signs of the end of the age. And so if you skip down to verse 32, actually, this is the fig tree, which I know that they do love this. But he talks about how, he says things like there will be tribulation, the sun will be dark and the moon won't give its light. There's going to be famines, there's going to be earthquakes, false Christs are going to arise. All these things he talks about that are going to happen. And then if you skip to verse 34, he says, truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. This generation. So there was a group of people surrounding Jesus, and he was looking at them and saying, hey, everything I just said to you that's going to happen, the generation that is alive right now, this current existing generation, it will not pass away until these things that I just mentioned, all these things take place. And so, I've almost reached the point where I look at this and say, okay, if all these people are right, that, this is referring to the end of the world, this would, in many ways, it seems like that would make Jesus a false prophet, because he predicted all these things were going to happen. And he said, this generation, like he put in a sense, he put like a date on it, or not a specific date, but he emphasized the time period that this would happen. And so I think when you look at this in light of thinking that, if Jesus was using all the symbolic language to refer to the events that happened in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem, I think rather than this becoming like something that makes Jesus lose credibility, it actually, strengthens sort of the idea that maybe he had something to say here. And it actually, I'd say, points to being more evidence that maybe Jesus did predict the future here, in a sense, And so I don't know, for those of you listening, if this all might be brand new for a lot of people. It might be way over all of your heads, and that's okay. This is something that would be maybe fun to get into a little bit more in the future, because I think it's important. I think it's important just because so many people get caught up in the Bible with all these places that they think are just these horrifically terrifying verses that are saying that any time now the world is just going to get horrible and things are getting worse and worse, and then the Antichrist is going to pop up, and then there's going to be all these terrible things that happen, and I think that sort of idea is not biblical, and I think there's a lot better ways to understand what Revelation is actually talking about and what Jesus is referring to in places like this, where it seems like he's maybe referring to the end of the world, but I think a closer look would say that, well, that's not really what he was even referring to. And when you understand the context and you understand the audience he was speaking to, and I just think there's a lot better ways of understanding that. So go ahead, Edgar.
Oh man, so yeah, I know we can't touch on Revelation. We'll say that for next time. But even Matthew chapter 24, you brought it up, right? That's very important. Even with the verse that you mentioned about this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. I can already see, putting my member hat on, the first thing that's coming on in their mind is they're thinking, well, but this is talking about the generation of when the fig tree would be fulfilled. So the generation that will not pass will be the one where the fig tree was fulfilled, which according to them was in 1948. Right. But when you look at Matthew in context, that's not what it's saying. And Matthew chapter 24, verse 1, it says, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came to him to call his attention to its building. Do you see all these things? He asked. Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. So what is the first thing that Jesus Christ is mentioning? They're walking, they see the temple, and the temple is a big deal in Israel at that time, because the temple is the temple is the only way the Israelites had in the old covenant system to be able to communicate with God. So it is the biggest thing in the Jewish mind at that time was the temple. It was the most revered thing. And then you have Jesus walking and saying, you see that? Not one stone will be left on another. And then the disciples says, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so what most cults do is they'll take the latter part and say, when will these things happen? Whether it's the fig tree or whatever, and they want to apply it to the last days. But Jesus Christ mentioned, the disciples' question was, when would the temple be destroyed? Because the temple being destroyed is connected to the sign of Christ's coming. And even to understand 100% that Jesus was talking to that generation, just flip the page in Matthew chapter 23. Look at what this whole chapter, Jesus is going, talking to the Pharisees and Sadducees, to the Israelites,
Right, exactly,
the
yeah.
people of that time. And he says here in verse 33, he says, "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore, I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly, I tell you, all this will come on this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." This is direct prophecy to what was going to take place in AD 70. That is when their house was left to them desolate. That is when one stone was not left on another. And that is when Christ appeared on the clouds of heaven. That is not a time in the future, 2,000 years removed in 1948. No, that is God coming to judge the Israelites who did not believe, and all the blood that they shed from all the prophets was poured out, just like Jesus prophesied in AD 70.
Yeah, you brought up, so verse 35, so that on you, again, speaking to the Jewish authorities, on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of Abel to Zechariah. Truly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So what generation? Well, he just said you, referring to those who were alive right then. He's saying this was going to come upon you, your generation. So he was pronouncing this judgment of God that was going to come upon the nation of Israel for their sin, for their killing of the prophets that had been sent to them. And Jesus is saying, you guys, like, you are sort of the culmination of the sin and rebellion of Israel, and now you're going to get the judgment. You're going to get the judgment that is due to Israel. The blood is going to be on you. The guilt is going to be, put on you, and this generation will not pass away until these things come to pass. Then if you jump to 24, where Jesus says all these things. What does he say? This generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. I think it becomes very clear that all these things that Jesus spoke of that were going to happen, Jesus said they would happen to this generation, not some future generation, not to me and you sitting here, but to that generation that he was speaking to. And so I think, again, like either that's true, or it seems like Jesus got it wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you read verse 15, it connects again Daniel's, and then you can also see where it's leading you to Revelation. In verse 15, it says, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Wichita, Kansas, South Korea, Europe." No, it says those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So he's talking to the audience, the Jews at that time. He's saying, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for there will be great distress unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. So Jesus Christ is mentioning and explaining 100% of the destruction that was coming to them in AD 70, even going as far as saying they better pray that their flight doesn't take place on a Sabbath or in a winter. That's not because people are keeping the Sabbath according to the missing the Sabbath day according to World Missionary Church of God. But that's because the reason why he was talking to the Jewish people who were keeping the Old Testament law. And when you're keeping the Sabbath in the Old Testament, you're shutting the gates to the city, right? So it's harder for you to get out when that situation was to happen. Winter, you don't want it to happen in the winter time. And this is exactly what happened when Rome came. They found Israel was asleep. They had denied Jesus Christ. God's people had already fled to the mountains, remembering the words of Matthew chapter 24. It's actually, it's history. It's a matter of fact that the Christians that were in the city of Jerusalem, when they saw Rome come, they fled to the mountains of Pella. And because they remember
many of them based on Jesus's words, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, the people that stayed, it was all the people that had rejected Jesus Christ. And so that's why Jesus had already prophesied all the blood is going to come on them. And that was the generation that was judged AD 70. And it even brings up the book of Daniel. It says, look at what was spoken of through the prophet Daniel. And the reader is supposed to understand fulfillment is happening at that time when these things happen. So when we get to Revelation, man, it's so amazing when we see, I think a lot of people, one of the biggest reasons is, when people think of Revelation and it being fulfilled, a lot of people are like, well, I don't know. That's kind of scary, because if Revelation is already fulfilled, then what is there for me? Does Revelation now, what do I have to live for? If Revelation was fulfilled 2,000 years ago, if Daniel was fulfilled 2,000 years ago, then how can then basically I have no purpose, and then God has no purpose for me. But if using that logic, then what about Galatians, Ephesians, Corinthians, Romans? Can you not find application? That was not written to you specifically to us in the 21st century here, in the United States of America. It was written to specific churches. But yet, even though those things were already fulfilled, you can apply it to your life to this day. In the same way, Daniel's and Revelation, just because it was fulfilled doesn't mean that there's not things that apply to us nowadays, and we still can receive those same applications.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to me, this is just this understanding of these things just makes these places in the Bible more, what's the word? I guess believable in a sense. It doesn't, less like a sci-fi sort of, when you think about all these things in Revelation, it's just it's like a sci-fi, like a wacky sci-fi movie. And it's just kind of hard to believe that those things would literally take place. But when you start to understand, again, the symbolic imagery that's being used, the hyperbolic language that Jesus uses, and John, and then you sort of tie that to the historical events and kind of see the correlation, you start to understand, he's not literally meaning that the sun will turn, or the moon will turn into liquid blood, and it's like there was it's just imagery, to exaggerated language to convey certain ideas. And again, you see this being done. I think the reason that this is like a viable and plausible and compelling view is because you see that throughout the Old Testament. You see the Old Testament prophets using all this exaggerated language for things. And then you see it happen, and, they're referring often to historical events. One of the prophets, I can't remember which, but talks about, God coming on the clouds, something about God coming on the clouds, riding with swift judgment or something like that. Yeah, and it's like, was there a point in history when Israel looked up in the sky and literally saw God surfing on the clouds and down in judgment? And no, again, that's just exaggerated language. And that's, I think, the same thing that's being done in Revelation, that is meant to convey sort of trying to convey an emotion and a sense of the urgency and the significance of these events. And so, I think that these things, when when I've thought about these things in that light, it for one, it makes Jesus's validity as a prophet a lot more like compelling, and seems like this is actually pretty good evidence for that. When you see him in Matthew 24 saying, hey, this is what's going to happen, and then you actually look on the timeline of history and see that, oh yeah, that did happen. That's compelling. When you think about it in terms of, oh well, he's prophesying the end of the world, and then all that's produced is religious group, Christian group after Christian group, predicting the end of the world over and over and over again based on these passages and getting it wrong. Like, that starts to make Christianity as a whole look bad if you assume that that's the way that those passages are meant to be understood.